2,500 years ago, a man was born whose ideas would shape the lives of billions and the thinking of a nation. The country is China. And his name is Kongzi, known in the West as Confucius. Born into an age of violence and war, Confucius was the creator of a political and moral philosophy that was designed to bring harmony to the chaos of his times. His extraordinary story saw his ideas rejected in his own lifetime. But adopted by China's emperor